Joining me is Professor Erica Scharrer from the University of Massachusetts Department of Communication, my undergraduate alma mater. Erica, we've had since the Newtown shooting, and really before then, but really it's been very prevalent since the Newtown shooting, this idea, in part perpetrated by those who want to avoid new regulations on guns, the finger pointed at violence in video games and or movies as a possible cause for gun violence in the United States. I think there's no better way to get into it than just to get your overall sense of that. You've studied this. This is an area that you know a lot about. What does research say about the effect of violence in video games and movies on real-world violence?
That's an excellent question, and it is the question of the hour for sure. And like a lot of questions, it's complicated. So my answer might be a little bit long. But you know, there is the job of the social science researcher is to try to examine these critical social questions as best as she or he can, given the limits of social science research. And you know, that sort of generic disclaimer will end up being pretty pertinent to this question, because what has been done pretty convincingly is that a link has been found in an experimental laboratory setting between people who play a violent video game or in some cases watch a violent movie or a violent television show and their aggression. And so the word aggression is sort of a pivotal word choice here. It's part of the rub in trying to answer the big question about whether media violence can indeed have a bearing on real world violence, is that there is inevitably a pretty big disconnect between the ways that we can measure aggression in a study, whether it's in a laboratory setting, or sometimes we also survey people to see, you know, oh, how much do you watch of this thing, or how much time do you spend with these sorts of media forms? And then we ask them to self-report either behavioral tendencies or attitudes toward aggression. Or in the laboratory setting, we might set up some sort of outcome that we measure the degree to which people will engage in it. So whether it's something like an evaluation of someone, which could be negative and harsh or could be gentle, expressions of hypotheticals, like what would you do in this scenario, and you try to measure the degree of aggression in the person's response.
So when you talk about measuring aggression, what you're saying is that there has been some link to some extent between violence in video games and movies and the definition of aggression as indicated by an academic survey or study that is done. But then the question of whether those people end up committing acts of violence, that does not exist at this point.
And I think it's almost impossible to have it exist. You know, there are a couple sort of more macro level observations to make that would help illuminate this question. And one is, you know, what are crime rates? You know, what is the status of crime rates either in the US or in other places of the world, and how might those correspond with the circulation of violent entertainment media? And they don't correspond. You know, we have more sources of entertainment violence, arguably, at this point in history than we ever have before. And yet, for the most part in the United States, violent crime is down. And you know, we can also make some cross-cultural comparisons that will call into question the overall potential of violent media to contribute to real-world violence. You know, what about in other locations where there are very similar media being circulated with similar amounts of violence? In fact, you know, one of the sort of goals for modern media companies to make money is for global circulation of their products. And so it's very similar media content, and yet cross-culturally often, you know, not similar at all violent crime rates. So clearly there's something more going on that the macro level of analysis will show us that sometimes those more micro level studies in, say, a lab setting might not.
A couple of years ago, we interviewed your colleague, Michael Morgan, and he was featured in the documentary film Mean World Syndrome. And one of the big takeaways from him was that violence in video games and movies does not make people more violent, but that it does make them more afraid of violence being committed against them. Now, some portion of crime maybe could be attributed to people being afraid and acting out of fear. And again, I'm being completely hypothetical and just imagining what other connections could someone draw. But to point to that as the link seems a little bit, not a very strong argument to make.
I agree. And I think, if we're talking about prevalence, how likely is there to be a link between some kind of violent media that someone consumed and an ultra aggressive or violent and terribly tragic, as we saw in Newtown and other school or mass shootings? That sort of connection is so, of course, obviously, logically less likely to occur. You can argue that by the tens of thousands to millions of people who consume the same media content as others and obviously do not have that extreme response. But if we talk about more prevalent effects, then we do get into things like Professor Morgan was talking about with this sort of concept of fear and that the world is a dangerous place. And as you said, too, that may then precipitate some sort of sense of being, armed and ready to deal with whatever the world may bring. Then the other consequence that I would like to point out is the notion of desensitization. And, I would argue that that's probably a more prevalent effect than a violent effect of violent media consumption is, and that's just the notion that the more we consume this stuff, the more our culture is flooded with violent images, the less likely they are to register as a big deal, the less likely they are to evoke a sympathetic response, the less likely they are to seem shocking or disturbing.
Yeah, and I think we've experienced that on this program even, because since the Newtown shooting, we've kind of, I don't know that we've been going out of our way, but I think a lot of media have been pointing to say, it's tragic the number of people that were killed in that one instance, but here's 20 others where only 1 or 2 people were killed. When you look at the specific circumstances, looked at individually, they should be shocking, but it's almost like they become part of this broader landscape that this stuff just happens all the time.
I think so. And that's what makes something like Newtown stand out. And I guess I'm glad that as a collective, we're not so desensitized as a culture.
That it's not even reported.
Exactly so. And that clearly there is an impact, and clearly there's an emotional impact from something like this, the tender age of the victims, the mass, quality of the shootings. And so, yes, I think that's right, that we read about this day in and day out in the news. If it's not in the news, it's in the television shows that we consume. If it's not in the television shows that we consume, it's in the games that we play. And so a certain level of expectation of violence surrounding us it seems to me, part of the modern sensibility. And just to connect sort of the macro level observation with more micro level studies, this too is something that researchers have studied in the lab or in, an experimental setting. And, there have been links found as well with the more someone is exposed to violent images, the less likely they will register some kind of concern. Sometimes that's physiological concern, like a heightened heart rate. Sometimes it's like self-report for sympathy for victims. And there have even been some studies where the researchers have set up this sort of false scenario where supposedly there's a fight breaking out, and people who are in this study, they've either seen something violent or violent media content, or they've seen non-violent media content, and the researchers study how long it takes for them to respond to this ostensible conflict that's emerging. And there has been a differential between the people who have seen the violent media content and those who have not. So this notion of desensitization, I think, is also a powerful one to consider.
Last thing then, just to circle back and kind of put the fine point on this, the specific claim by the NRA and other groups that violence in video games and movies is directly responsible for the gun violence problem in this country. Academically, there is nothing that would support that statement.
I would just trace back to the concept of aggression.
Okay.
And can I mention too, David, that there is what we call a meta-analysis, and that's an analysis, a quantitative sort of aggregation of all the existing studies on a single topic. And there are meta-analyses seem to be sort of a way to make a pretty massive claim based on a big body of research. And there is a meta-analysis that was done on television violence and aggression. And what that found is that the size of the influence of the television effect on the concept of aggression, as it's been studied in lots of different ways, the size of that effect shrinks when that aggressive outcome is more severe. So in something like a real life shooting, which is thankfully still an extreme and severe act of violence, the statistical link between media exposure has been shown to be smaller than a more minor aggressive response.
All right, we've been speaking with Professor Erica Scharrer from the University of Massachusetts Department of Communication. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much.